Hey, what's going on there guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this video we're going to be converting this caricature drawing by Irving Strong into this surreal 3D animation, all from using Photomotion depth. Seeing as this is a flat image and there isn't much really to go in the way of layers in terms of that depth mask, we're not going to be using smart depth within this example, but we'll show you guys how to paint that depth in only using the brush tool. So without any further delays, let's get to the tutorial. We're first going to access this Photomotion X folder here, which basically contains all of our projections. When we're in this folder, we're just going to navigate down to this Photomotion depth folder here, and finally, when we're in that folder, we'll just double click on the project file here, which will load After Effects. Now, Photomotion is of course a project-based application, so we don't need any additional plugins to get the ball rolling, just the assets from that zip file. Okay, right, now that that's done, we're in the Photomotion depth project. First, what we need to do is just double click on this Start Depth button here, and then we're in the main dashboard. We'll then need to just double click on this Add Photo button here, as well, that's the first step of the animation process. We're now inside this blank composition where we're seeing nothing here, and if you see this, you're in the right place for this step. The next step is, well, to import in our picture, and we could do so by either using the import function or going to the desktop and dragging it into the project panel over here. Once it's in here and we have this image within the project tab, all we need to do is just basically drag and drop it into the composition and then parent it to the parent settings layer here, and we'll do that whilst holding shift. Now let's just get this image to fit using the scaling and positioning attributes here. First, we'll just adjust the scale to something like 71% where it's mostly in frame, and then we'll just adjust the position so it's slightly framed a little bit better in terms of this composition. We'll want it to mostly fit within the viewport here, to the extent that the doodle is in the center of the frame. Now, on a very quick side note, in case you're a little bit unsure, a depth map is a black and white representation of how close elements are to a 3D camera, as it were. So the more white it is, the more closer it is, and therefore the more movement you'll see, while the more darker it is, the less movement you'll see, all the way to black where you won't see any movement at all. Okay, so with that positioning and scaling sorted, let's get to creating that depth map. When we're back at the main composition, the first thing that we'll want to do is just double click on this Add Depth button down here to get access into this composition. Normally, in most examples we've made for depth, we'd use this Smart Depth option you can see over here. However, within this example, that might be a tad difficult as it's a drawing and it's also fairly, well, unrealistic, let's put it that way. The simplest thing to do within this circumstance would be to actually paint it in. So let's just select this Paint Depth button over here, and then with our playhead at the very beginning, that's pretty crucial, otherwise we'll run into problems, we'll then go up here and swap out the selection tool for the brush tool. The next step is just double clicking on the viewport here, which will just change it ever so slightly. Lastly, we'll just go over to the paint panel over here, ensuring that the swatch here is set to white, and of course the flow is at 5% for a nice smooth brush, and finally the diameter is to our liking. The diameter is fairly subjective whilst painting this depth map in, so don't feel like you need to have it exactly how it is in our case. Just make sure the swatch is set to white and the flow is set to 5%. We'll of course be changing the diameter multiple times throughout this sequence. Now, we're not seeing anything on the viewport here, it's completely blank, which of course isn't helpful at all, so let's go over to Effect Controls and then bring up the image layer opacity. If we don't see Effect Controls, by the way, just make sure to go over to Window here and then select this Effect Controls here, which will bring that over into the left here. When we see this appear, we'll just bring up the image layer opacity to see a working guide of the original. Now when that's done, time to start painting. We'll first start with the hands and arms with just a fairly large brush here, and we'll want to make sure that the center and more to the bottom of these arms is slightly more white to the top, of course, as in reality those will be closer to the camera. The next step is just filling in the face of the drawing with just a faint outline of white. Try not to spill over the outline of the drawing here though. though. Now that the face has some white in the center of it, let's get to filling in some of the finer details. First, we'll change the diameter of the brush here. We'll want to fill in the areas that we've missed out, like the thumb here, and then we'll just go over to these fingers here and add some white paint to them, and finally we'll add a little bit more to this pen here too. We'll also zoom in a bit too into this illustration here, and then start to fill out the structures of the face here. So we'll want to start with the chin, fill that in of course, making sure that the edges are nice and pronounced. Then we'll move over to the chin bones here, to the nostril, and of course then to the higher cheekbones. Lastly, just getting in some of the eyebrow ridge and eyebrows too. Again, filling in these prominent features which have been over-exaggerated or distorted within the illustration. We want to make those elements really pop within the animation. We'll finish off the rest of these features here, adding in some to the lips here, the upper nostril, the nose ridge here, and then to the upper eyebrows over here. Okay, so the next step here is filling out the rest of the details. We'll start with the ears of course here, and then move up to the hair, and then fill in the rest of the details. Again, we'll really want to pronounce those areas which the illustration emphasizes, like the neck here, the jacket here, and finally even maybe fill out the face a little bit more just to ensure that the proportions aren't too over-exaggerated. When of course finished with the final last details, we'll then navigate over to Effect Controls here and then bring this paint image layer opacity right down to see the results. Not too bad, and you can see that it's actually a pretty good depth representation of our original image, coming together really quite nicely, and that's the really complicated part of this class over and done with. Just before moving on, next let's just go to swapping out the brush tool with the selection tool, as of course we don't want to be painting over anything anymore. And lastly, we'll just get to the main dashboard. Okay, so with our depth map all set up, let's get to animating this image. We'll want to go to the central controller for this one, and if you check out the final animation, you can see that the motion here isn't really too complex. Okay, so let's just click and drag on the central controller here to the left, which will, of course, manipulate the displacement map. Pretty good, and the next step is just going down to the working area here and moving our playhead to around the 30 frames point, and from there we'll go back to the main dashboard and then move our controller to the far right. Now here's something neat. Let's bring our playhead to the 60 frame point, and as you can see, when we do so, the controller here reverts back to that far left position that we moved it to earlier at the 00 frame point. That's because of this auto loop system, which will automatically loop the animation back out. So the animation is 30 frames to get to that end point, which is to the far right, so it will take another 30 frames to get back to that starting position of course. Now, with our playhead at the 60 frame point, let's mark the end of our working area. Nice, and if we preview that, you can see that it loops in and out rather quite seamlessly here, and we can see that our depth map is interacting with Photomotion depth extremely well. This would be quite eye-catching for a potential artist to showcase their work over something like Instagram, say for example. So with that out of the way, let's get to the next part, adding particles into our animation. We can do so by just clicking on the settings button down here to the right, and then navigating over to Effect Controls again. What we'll want to do is just check this Activate Particles checkbox. We'll then change this particle type here and bring it to something like 16, which are these specks here, which are a little bit more seamless than the petals we were stuck with earlier. Finally, we'll just make them slightly less distracting by going over to color correction here, and then changing this channel here from RGB to alpha, and then proceed to bring down all of the alpha highlights here, just clipping them out, which will in turn dull out the brightest areas of these particles. There we go, they're a little bit more inconspicuous now. We'll still want to make this a little less populated though, and we can do that by just clicking on this distant button over here on the main dashboard, and then just go back over to Effect Controls, just unchecking this Activate checkbox here. What that will do is entirely disable the distant particle layer here, so we won't see any of them of course. We'll then do exactly the same with the further particles too, just disable them in order to make this animation slightly less visually busy. As we can see, this has turned out rather quite decent, and those particles are adding another element of depth, which is really making this animation pop. So with that done, let's think about rendering. First, before we get to rendering, we'll need to click on the resolution button up here on the main dashboard, and then we'll jump into Effect Controls. We'll want to change this export resolution here from 1080p to 4K, which, by the way, won't change your preview resolution. Next, we'll double click on this export button down here in order to get access to that export resolution and, of course, the perfect cut system. Cool, so with that done, let's set our working path. As you can see, Photomotion Perfect Cut is giving us data on all of these potential loops, which we could use to export our animation. As you can see, Photomotion Perfect Cut is giving us data on all of these potential loops, which we could use to export our animation. Since our playhead was already on that 60 frame point when we entered this composition, we've actually already got a green light for one loop. However, what if we wanted two loops, the 180 frame point? Well, that's no problem at all. What we'll need to do is just go down here to the 60 frame point and then change the 60 to 180. By the way, if you don't see frames, just control click on timecode here to bring up the frames, and finally just type out 180, which will bring our playhead to the 180 frame mark. And finally, let's not forget, of course, to mark out. When finished, we should have something like this on screen. Now, there is one final finishing touch that we can add, and that's vignetting. So let's just select the settings button over here and then go over to Effect Controls just here. And finally, what we can do is just bring up this vignetting slider, which will help hone in our intended viewer's attention here. Pretty neat, and with that done, we can see this animation is looking, quite close to done now. Okay, now that we're happy with it, let's just get to exporting it out now by going over to Composition here and then select this Add to Render Queue, which will add the working area that we've got selected into the After Effects render engine. The next step after finishing this is just going down here to the render engine and then clicking on this lossless, as we want to change the export format here. When in the output settings menu, we'll change the output format from AVI to QuickTime and then hit OK. Before rendering, by the way, just to make sure that the output settings over here are to, of course, your liking, and then we're home free to hit render. Now, of course, what if we wanted this animation to go up on social media? Well, what we can do is bring the end export into Adobe Media Encoder. So let's just boot up Media Encoder, and with our render imported into it, let's just make sure that the format is set to H.264 and of course the output location is to our liking. Finally, let's just render, and there we go. This animation is now complete and we have this really surreal cool sequence which adds quite a lot of life to this drawing here. Really quite eye-catching. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, feel free to check those out.